All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Community Resilience Conversation. My name is Laird Christensen, and I direct the Masters of Science program in Resilient and Sustainable Communities here at Prescott College. And today's conversation is going to focus on lessons for ecological design from the current pandemic that we're going through. And just as a way of setting up the conversation a little bit, I'm assuming most people drawn to this conversation have some sense of what we mean by ecological design. But as I was thinking about it, it seems to me that humans have been developing structures and systems that would qualify as ecological design for almost all of our history as a species. It's really only over the last 50 years or so that we've had to begin to adjust our design of human systems as a response to the obvious violation, I guess, of our contract with the natural systems that support us. So if we think about ecological design as design systems, strategies, practices that both adapt to and integrate with natural processes, that's generally what we're talking about here. And that can go from designing your garden to your home, to entire cities, from thinking about water catchment or water diversion on your own property to larger systems of urban infrastructure, transportation systems. And it's while I was thinking about transportation systems that it occurred to me that this pandemic, this current global pandemic, is so qualitatively different from the last one that people talk about back in 1918 with the Spanish flu, in part because our transportation systems, our access to global transportation has evolved so much just in the last 50 years or so. I'm old enough now to remember that it used to be pretty rare when I was a kid for people to travel regularly by air for pleasure, that sort of thing. And now we just take that for granted. Well, what that means is that we haven't sufficiently imagined the unintended consequences of the ease of travel that our commercial and technological systems have enabled now. So we're in a new context for thinking about global pandemic. And we're very fortunate to have with us today a number of professionals in the field, architects, designers, planners, to help us think about how our sense of ecological design might evolve in response to what we're learning about the current global pandemic. So what I'm going to do is I've asked 5 people to join us to present their own work briefly today in the hopes that we can actually extend that to a conversation in the latter half of the meeting. And so what I'd like to do is just ask folks to briefly introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their own work that they're doing, and then we'll move from there into considering the ways that the pandemic is leading us to rethink ecological design. I do want to begin with my colleague, Tony Brown, who is a pioneer in the field. He worked with Paolo Soleri for a number of years and eventually created the ECOSA Institute, which is now in partnership with Prescott College, institute around ecological design. So Tony, if you could just tell us a little bit about your own work, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, it's been a long life, so I don't know how long I really have. So I got my degree in architecture in England, transitioned to the US in 1968, right in the middle of the Democratic National Convention there when the Chicago police were beating up students. I've seen the whole transition from the optimism of the hippie days to the uncertainty, to say the least, of the Trump days. I really have been working for what I classify as corporate architects up until 1971, when I came to Arizona to join Soleri in his project called Arcosanti, which is a concept for a city that solves, in my opinion, most of the problems that we're looking at today. So I started the ECOSA Institute basically with the realization that everything is connected. So it's not just about architecture, it's about interior design, architecture, design of products, design of systems, trying to connect all these things together in the complex way that they actually function. Because I think what often happens is that we tend to try and make change which is within an existing structure. And this is sort of first order change. And what I'm hoping we can do is, after this virus event, is move into second order change, which is actually changing the systems themselves, rather than trying to change pieces within an existing system. So what we do at ECOSA is we have a 16-week program, and students come, and many of them have never drawn anything before. They don't know much about architecture or design. We put them on a crash course to teach them how to draw buildings, draw products, and to learn design methods, design thinking, how do designers think. And we end the semester with a group project, which is a pretty big project. Right now, we are working on a site for a person who's not a developer but wants to develop the site with 195 houses. And it's a very tricky site because it's very hilly. So we are now in the throes of that, and trying to do this project on Zoom is really a challenge because they're all over the country, and we're trying to review their drawings online with, there's a thing called Jamboard, which is like I can actually draw on their drawings, which is helping a lot. I would say over the last, I don't know, 6 weeks to a month, I've been really on a crash course on online teaching. I still don't like it, even though now I know what I'm doing, more or less. So that's my intro.
Laird, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. So we'll be back to Tony in a few minutes. I'd like to introduce to you now Lucas Brown, former colleague of mine and the founder of Brownsmith Studios in Indiana. Lucas also teaches at the University of Indiana. And Lucas, rather than having me describe what you do, if you can just talk a little bit about your own work, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Laird. First of all, I want to say hello to everybody. I see a familiar face down there, Katie May. Great seeing you. And Tony, it's been a long time. Really a pleasure meeting you. You know, we have a common friend, Plenty Fisk, who I started my career with. So, and of course, Andrew and Steve, great to be talking with all of you here. So brief rundown on my my history. I started at Ball State University, where I received my undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture, and from there I ran off to Austin, Texas to work at the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems with Plenty Fisk and Gail Vittori, real leaders. You know, I see Tony Brown and Plenty and Gail and these people, you know, that were doing all this really important work back in the 60s and 70s as being, you know, the real front runners here. So that was a great experience, and I learned a lot about open building systems, sustainable design, resource integration, which is a topic that I wrote my master's thesis on. And from there I had a varied career and basically pursuing things that I was really interested in. I went from the nonprofit sector to designing and building furniture with Mark Machek, this amazing furniture designer who was also an architecture graduate. And then on to work with Murray Legg at LZT Architects, doing sustainable buildings in Austin, Texas, performing arts, theaters, children's shelters, both large and small scale projects. And then I got to team up with Laird at Green Mountain College, and one of the most amazing group of people that I've ever worked with as an institution. Amazing experience. And we developed the READ program, which Katie May is a graduate student here. The program was started off as a renewable energy and ecological design program, really rooted in the environmental liberal arts. And as it developed, we started to focus on job training within that environmental liberal arts program. And I'm saying that because this is where I want to go with the talk today. We really started to look at where people could be going in the ecological design, renewable energy sector, how to build an educational program that would provide that scaffolding so that they could get into those job opportunities. And it's a great program. Andrew taught in the READ program. It was a lot of fun. It was really sad to see it go. I now run Brownsmith Studios, small 2-person firm in Bloomington, Indiana. We have I'm in my studio now. Outside of this door, there's a 1,400 square foot shop with a woodworking shop, steel fabrication, CNC machinery. So we do architecture, design, and custom fabrications. We're involved in all aspects of the built environment. We're also builders. We're building a house right now. We focus on climate design principles. I would call it bioregional design, where we're looking toward local skills, local building techniques, and local materials to inform our design work. And we also do a lot of advanced computational design and digital fabrication projects sort of all over the country on these really sort of advanced public art complex projects. So I'll pass it from there.
Thank you, Lucas. Next, we have Steve Whitman. Steve is the principal and founder of Resilience Planning and Design up in, I believe, Plymouth, New Hampshire. I might have the town wrong. It's an honor to me that we had Steve design one of the founding courses in our Resilient and Sustainable Communities program. So, Steve, if you can talk a little bit about your own work, that would be wonderful.
Sure, thanks, Laird. It's nice to be here with everybody. I actually see one of my existing students, Kyle, tuning in from Los Angeles. Good to see you, Kyle, and a couple other friends here. So my background is in community and environmental planning. My master's is in planning from University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I worked as a public sector planner at the town level, regional, and state level here in the Northeast before going into consulting. I've now been a consultant working with private sector developers on occasion, nonprofit groups on occasion, but largely with municipalities and state agencies on long-range planning and increasingly on integrated design. The firm is now going into its 7th year. We do a combination of parcel level design, neighborhood, downtown urban type of designs, but we do a lot more open space and comprehensive planning, even at the watershed scale. And I also have a doctorate in education, and the focus of my research has been on the integration of green infrastructure or living infrastructure in the municipal process. So one of the things I'll hope to touch on later is better post-pandemic, better leveraging the systems we have in place because we're underutilizing them now, while I also want to spend some time with Tony thinking about how we can also change systems. So let's leverage what we have, but then let's also be willing to let some of those systems maybe go. I also am involved in some nonprofit work here in the Northeast, and I think that's probably enough. Do a little teaching in higher ed still, but not as much anymore. So I will pass the baton. Thanks, Laird.
You bet, Steve. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you also have background in permaculture, don't you?
I do, yes.
Okay.
Taught a lot of permaculture classes over the years.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that because one of the folks who we had invited to be here, who doesn't look like they're with us yet, is a permaculture instructor. And I thought that would be an interesting point to bring into the conversation at some point. How do the principles of permacultural design perhaps influence the way that we want to think about redesigning our living spaces in the time of pandemic? And I know that you also have, and our next speaker, Andy Keller, also has some background in thinking about participatory planning, or thinking about how do we bring the perspectives of multiple stakeholders into the planning or the revisioning process. I think that's one of the most exciting things that I'm seeing emerge from the collective response to the pandemic right now is through mutual aid activities, really people stepping up to take over where institutions are not always prepared to do that. And I think that applies to planning as well. But I do want to pass it along to Andy Keller, who is with us today. Andy Keller has his own design company, Andrew Keller Design, but also worked for years before coming to Green Mountain College for Yestermorrow School of Design up in Vermont. So Andy, can you tell us a little bit about your own work?
Yeah, of course. Well, hey folks, I got to tell you, given all this social distancing and isolation, I'm so jonesing for just this that this is really doing it for me. So, Laird, thanks for inviting me. You know, I think if I had to summarize my background, it's been one of excitement and frustration about the same thing. Is that everything about my background has been about connecting things. And while it seems so obviously relevant to us right here, much of the world has not taken on that thought process. So it's been a very frustrating journey for me. You know, honestly, I started off as an English major, which I think is really quite relevant because English majors deal with the human condition. And that was my background. Looking at the anthropology, the sociological, the psychological impacts of how we engage with each other in our surroundings. And you know, that very quickly led me to the built environment. And finally, Berkeley, UC Berkeley, which just couldn't have been the better spot to land in, because yes, I'm licensed as an architect, but frankly, I spent as much as my time in the planning department and the landscape architecture department, because, you know, yeah, buildings are important. We know that 40% of our energy and resources go into, you know, degrading our environment, et cetera, vitally important. But what about the experience? What about the human experience? What about the biophysical experience? Well, thankfully, I was able to get beyond those walls and talk to other colleagues at UC Berkeley and expand my expand the questions that I want that need to be asked. I was fortunate, for example, to work with Randy Hester, who fantastic book, if anyone knows about it, Ecological Democracy, who addresses these questions like I don't think anyone else really has, quite frankly. He's still a mentor to me that is a leader. But I think very curiously, and I think very relevant to where we are today, as soon as I left Berkeley, well, I was like Jonathan Edwards way back when he decided to engage with the Native Americans. He felt like he had left civilization, which of course is not truly the case. We know that Native Americans are as valuable as any other voice, but he felt alone. He felt alienated, that no one else spoke his language. And when I joined the commercial architecture world, though green building was important, holistic thinking was not. They were solving energy and resource issues by LEED buildings. But again, what about that human experience? What about that biophysical experience? It was extraordinarily limited. It was discouraging. I was fortunate to join Green Mountain College so I could start to actually truly 100% of my time investigate these questions that I thought were important. sadly at Greenmount College met a certain demise. But I'm pretty excited now to be joining Laird and Tony and perhaps others. I didn't quite get everyone's resume yet, to join Prescott's world and helping design a new ecological design course, which I got to tell you, Laird, I'm pretty excited about. I got some stuff that, you know, I think it's gonna rock some worlds. About it's not just about the things we produce, but the process with which we ask these questions. And I think that's what's so great about ecological design. We're going to bring in permaculture, which I taught a lot at Yestermorrow. You know, we're going to bring in the social sciences. We're going to bring in the biophysical sciences. We're also going to talk about our own limitations. How come we don't break these paradigms? Well, maybe you can see in my enthusiasm here. I'm pretty excited to be with you folks. I don't know if I'm over my 5 minutes, but we'll stop there.
Right. I appreciate that, Andy. And before we move on, I just want to make sure that the other person that we invited, Jesse Hernrich, is not on somebody else's device here. Is Jesse with us? Okay, it doesn't seem like she is, but maybe she'll jump in at some point soon. I do actually notice, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Jen, that we have Jen Weaver on the call too. Jen is the mayor of Hillsborough, North Carolina, and it might be interesting at some point during the conversation to hear about how as a city administrator you're thinking about planning too. But let's go ahead and just turn to the main question of conversation, and we'll start with you, Tony. As we find ourselves social distancing, going through this pandemic in really unprecedented ways, how has this led you to think differently about the work that you're doing in ecological design?
That's a really big question, and I've been pondering it ever since you raised it. It's really hard to actually predict the future. So I feel like we're now on this knife edge between a new blossoming of ideas and a new dark ages. And which way it goes is anybody's guess at this point. So being an optimist, I'm going to assume we're going to come out of this and we're going to go, wow, now we know what the problems are, let's go about solving them. And one of the things that's been really interesting is that we are working on this project, which is, you know, a development project. We're trying to do a regenerative design approach to it, but we still have roads on it. We still have utilities to put in. We still have all these constraints. We have to move a lot of earth. So I began to look at what's the balance between what we're doing currently and how could we do it differently in the future. And one of the tenets of regenerative design is that whatever you design really needs to be an evolutionary project. In other words, it's a project that sets up the conditions so that it continually can change and can improve and can expand to become something else. So we're trying to talk to the client, the developer, to suggest that maybe we could use this project as a way of showing that regenerative design is not only something that is critical, but is something that actually can be economically sound. And the problem is, I don't want to use the word economically sound because that immediately pushes us into accounting. And I think what we have to do is change the accounting system to say, what are the benefits in human terms to doing this project this way? For example, does it create community? Does it create health in the people that are going to live there? Does it educate them about the environment that they're set in? How do we achieve that other than, you know, setting up a classroom and forcing them to come into the classroom? Can the environment itself actually become the teacher for these people who eventually would move into this project? Does it actually solve some of the issues that we're facing, particularly in Prescott and actually all over the country, where affordable housing is disappearing or has disappeared already? So can it be that part of this project would not only be for people who could afford to buy a house there, but also for people who need more affordable housing situations? And the typical way of doing a development in this town, I actually just drove around Prescott yesterday to get out of the house. I feel like I'm a dog, you know, oh good, can we go in the car? So we drove around and took pictures of hillside developments in town here. And it's quite horrific, in fact. These houses are anywhere from 5,000 square foot up. They're on hillsides which have been radically changed to house them. And they're really not producing anything in the way of community or any kind of long-term evolutionary benefit. So I'm hoping, and you know, hope is not a strategy, but I'm hoping that this whole crisis is really beginning to show people that we need a totally different approach to this kind of thing. Obviously, as it is right now, we have to have roads, but I think one of the things we need to do is change the questions that we ask ourselves, very, very much like Andrew's talking about. For example, we always talk about transportation. Well, maybe we should talk about access, because transportation and access are two totally different things, in my opinion. For example, dense neighborhoods can provide access without having to get into a car and drive 10, 15, 20 minutes to go somewhere to get something. So how do you do that? That's an interesting question. Being an alum of Arcasanti, obviously building ecologies would be my answer, but again, it's not likely to happen immediately. So I think that the real question for me is, after this crisis, have we really learned any lessons about income disparity, healthcare processes, all the things that I'm sure you're all aware of just from having to look at the news from time to time? So I'm not terribly good at predicting the future, because I have no idea what the future is. My whole career has been making snap decisions about things every now and again and getting myself in trouble. So, you know, I really believe that there's an opportunity here. There's a lot of danger here too, but I think if we can grasp the opportunity to really begin to question this, because we have this incredible example of what happens when we are faced with a crisis. And this is only the first of many crises that are going to come along, because climate change hasn't gone away just because we got a virus problem. So we're going to have, you know, displacement of people through sea level rise. We're going to have, you know, food issues because of crops not producing as much as they usually do. So, you know, to me, this crisis has to be a wake-up call so that we can begin to plan, how do we deal with these other crises? How do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with, you know, things like food security and income security and so on? And I think my view is that community is really the solution to this. We need to create real communities, not just a bunch of houses that are sitting, you know, in a development, but how do you actually create the conditions so that people will naturally gravitate towards a community condition. So that's where I'm starting from. I don't want to keep going on and on and on, but I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say.
All right, thank you, Tony. And I appreciate you reminding us there that things like ecological systems and distribution networks of food or energy or whatever it may be are also issues that that ecological design could and should be speaking to beyond just the built environment. Lucas, I want to move on to you now. And do you need me to remind you of the general question, or are you good to go?
No, I'm good, Laird. This is great, Tony. Thanks for your response. I'm going to try to touch on a few of the points that you brought up there. There's so many ways to think about what's going on right now as a designer. I'm going to focus on three components of what's going on right now with this pandemic. I'm going to borrow this from Cameron Sinclair and his book over here, Design Like You Give a Damn, and upside down. Basically, it's how designers respond to, let's say, a natural disaster, and that happens in three phases. The first phase is the emergency response. You know, if you want to look at your Maslow's hierarchy, let's just get people in shelter, let's get them fed, let's make sure they have water. Boom, number one. Number two is going to be a transitional phase, and that's going to be more sort of semi-permanent shelter that provides more comfort and allows a community to come back and reestablish themselves more permanently. And then the permanent rebuilding of a community is a rebuilding that recognizes what happened with the disaster, and that community should be more resilient and be able to adapt to the disaster the next time it comes around. So very similar to what we're dealing with now with a pandemic, a different type of natural disaster. So if we run that as a parallel, we can look at this first phase of the pandemic, and I would call that the stock up on toilet paper phase. And that's when everybody sort of freaked out in fight or flight mode. What's interesting about this phase is that everybody immediately questioned where they stand financially, where they stand in terms of resources, and how they're going to support their families, right? So the question is whether or not that immediate response and evaluation of where we were in the stock up on toilet paper phase is going to have an impact on us as we go into transitional and permanent phases. The things I observed during this first phase, well, number one, the design and architecture community kind of came out pretty quickly, and they started designing and making face masks with 3D printers and laser cutters, which I thought was really pretty cool. They were proposing ideas for pop-up health clinics. So there was this emergency sort of response by the architecture and design industry. The other interesting thing coming out of it were just like how we build our environments, our existing environments, around a 6-foot social distancing sort of guideline. So all of a sudden you interact with your neighbors from across the street, where you do have to go into stores. The stores and retail establishments had to redesign the way that you move through the store and check out. So this emergency phase is very much, again, about those basic needs, not so much about long-term ecological planning, but hopefully responses to this crisis that will inform that more long-term ecological design and planning phase. Second phase, transitional phase, we'll call that the stay-at-home phase. And that's where we've kind of gotten over the fight or flight. We're staying at home, we're isolating, we're doing what we need to do. And there are so many ways to think about this stay-at-home phase. And I will say that while I think that a lot of things happening right now, especially for the disadvantaged, is very, very challenging. For those that are a little bit more advantaged, there have been some silver linings associated with the stay-at-home phase, such as, less consumerism, number one, and it feels pretty good, right? Not to be going out and shopping, and to be conserving, and to be spending time with your family, and to just have more time in general. So there are a lot of very interesting aspects of the stay-at-home phase. But I want to look at the unemployment, and we've had 22 million people file for unemployment in the last 4 weeks. I mean, it's just astounding. And so these people that are now out of work or they have limited income are questioning how they're spending their money, how much they're spending on utilities, mortgages, food, et cetera. And so what seemed to be consistent and solid vanished. And now, again, that questioning of how to parse out their resources. So what do you do with the 22 million people? And this is kind of the big idea here. And this links back to this notion of access and how we build communities and what we did with the READ program in terms of integrating job training with an environmental liberal arts curriculum. Is maybe there's some type of low-cost educational / career training program out there that gets people into a system that teaches them how to address issues of renewable energy, energy conservation, and design. And design, I'm going to leave it as somewhat of a broad category, but I would say in this context, we talk about ecological design responses to building more sustainable communities and how that might play out, be it a home builder or somebody that's doing product design, et cetera. So we have this, some examples here. Van Jones and Majora Carter both were able to create these green job programs. Van Jones in California put unemployed people to work putting solar panels on houses, and Majora Carter put people to work putting green roofs on buildings in the Bronx to build better communities. So we might be able to look toward them as potential examples of how we might be able to take a large portion or a large population of unemployed people and put them back to work. And this is going to build stronger communities. It's going to address issues of climate change like Tony brought up and like we're all thinking about. And so that's maybe part of this transitional phase as people are going into unemployment, what kind of educational opportunities they have access to. Going into the permanent phase of rebuilding, we could start to look toward some serious discussion about climate change, maybe at a national level, at a state level, and in our local communities, where we could start to build programs that incentivize homeowners and businesses and institutions to start implementing renewable energy strategies, energy conservation, and locally based design and micro-manufacturing businesses. That could take any number of forms. Those are the ideas that I'm grappling with right now. It's how we put these people to work through educational programs to build more sustainable communities in the future.
Thanks, Lucas. That's a really helpful framework. I appreciate you sharing that. Steve, how have you been thinking a little differently about your work in the age of pandemic?
I think the ideas I came onto the call with have changed greatly just in listening to everybody. And I hope I leave something for Andrew. But I just wanted to touch on a couple of the threads that both Tony and Lucas were just sharing with us. And so I think more than ever post-pandemic with our clients, especially with the communities we work with, I'm going to be a stronger than ever proponent of integration of nature and food systems. We've been really advocating for this idea of integrating living infrastructure at every level, no matter how small the parcel, whether it's on the sides and tops of buildings or whether it's part of community spaces on parcels and private spaces, but that it be integrated and that it be a system within the community and beyond community boundaries. I think what we're seeing right now is people's desire to spend some of their time outside of their home in a natural setting, and we're seeing parks and open spaces shut down, and people don't have access to open space in a lot of cases or don't have the benefit of the time to get there. And so more than just the current push for open space within a 10-minute walk, open space outside the door, no matter how small. And make that open space as integrated with the rest of the built environment as possible. And so, and food systems, this is happening at a time where a lot of us are thinking about the beginning of a growing season. Some parts of the country have a kind of perpetual growing season, but we're all so disconnected from food systems I have never been so afraid for my spouse, who has taken on the responsibility to go to the grocery store, of all places. And I have never wanted to see her like change out of all her grocery attire as soon as she gets home. And then the talk of, you know, what do we have available through our local farms? What can we produce on our own site? What can we actually start to process and preserve and share with neighbors as well? And it's been part of our local resiliency conversations here in New Hampshire. And so if being a proponent for integration of nature and food systems is one of the takeaways I wanted to share today, it's doing that in that participatory planning process that you talked about, Laird. You know, it's hearing from other people what their experience was like in their community through this. And there are probably other threads of this that I'm not aware of or I'm not sharing now, but letting those stories come out and having them help drive the policy and the non-regulatory decision-making at the local level. I think in doing that, we can get at some of that community building that Tony was talking about. Ultimately, to be a resilient community, I think the number one thing is how do we build relationships and social capital? I'm seeing tremendous amounts of social capital and strength between people who may not agree on a lot, probably don't agree on climate change or a lot of politics pre-pandemic, but they are the ones making masks for each other, shopping for each other, doing these things. And it really shows the strength of some of these neighborhoods and communities that we all live in and why we're there. And I think permaculture is just one framework or design process that can be used to do this work. I think having worked with it and knowing some of the other speakers have worked with it, I see the promise in the observation and the real thoughtful way that we approach understanding both site considerations and our own goals, our own needs, whether it's at the parcel level or the municipal level or beyond. But I do think that that is promising. And I do think that a lot of the permaculture and ecological design folks and architectural folks that are out there are stepping up, as Lucas said, to kind of be those leaders and those life rafts in our communities. And there'll be a lot of innovation, and I'm hoping we can keep some of that going forward. And then the last piece I would just share goes back to kind of Tony's comment about accounting. And I often think about it in the sense of ecosystem services and, you know, how much yield, how many benefits can we get? And so a lot of times in being a proponent of ecological design, I say, wow, yeah, you do have to deal with stormwater because your regulatory obligations require you to do so. But wow, what if you could get shade trees and food and access to the outdoors and you could feel better and you just start ticking off all those ecosystem services? I think a lot of us are tuned into that more now than maybe we were a month ago. And I'll leave it at that, Laird. You're muted, just so you know. I'm helping out, Lucas.
All right. So Andy, I'm going to throw the same question to you, and after you've answered that question, we'll open it up for a larger conversation here. But how has this pandemic begun to change the way that you think about your work in ecological design, Andy?
Well, I just want to echo everyone's sentiment here, beginning with, well, Tony, Lucas, Steve, yourself, Laird. Well, lo and behold, it turns out everything is connected. Who knew? I mean, it's really happening. I really geeked out on this, Laird. Part of it is because I'm creating this course for Laird right now. So my mind's particularly in the game right now. But obviously, we've got a health crisis. We might have noticed that. Apparently, there's an economic crisis. But we have a political and cultural crisis, right? Where ideology is running in conflict with science. Corona is being called the Chinese virus, right? Asian Americans are being blamed for the virus. People are assuming that there's Black American immunity to the virus. So all kinds of cultural myths are being pulled into this world. There's an intersectional social justice virus, where we're talking about the elderly and low income, who are the most vulnerable. I'm impressed by how structural racism is poking its head up now. where those who are poor or aren't powerful in the political realm all of a sudden are disempowered even more than they ever imagined they would be through this crisis. They're more vulnerable to the coronavirus. It's extraordinary. Domestic violence is increasing more than everyone ever expected it to. It's extraordinary, all the little steps, all the little portions of our infinite experience are all being pulled into now. That a linear, reductive mindset really isn't helping us right now. You know, it's amazing. There's even a technological crisis, I would argue, that right now, we're waiting for a coronavirus vaccination solution. Well, that's not happening right now, is it? But what is happening? A low-tech solution, something that's more attuned to our everyday experience. Social distancing and herd immunity, might actually be our savior. Well, I find that really intriguing. Even within ecological design worlds, at least relative to my experience, there's been such a focus upon, for example, building science. Well, it's great. Let's save some energy, save some resources, filter some air. That's really good. Let's keep doing that. But that's not really helping us right now, is it? Not really in the big picture. So you know, what can we do? What is our real mindset right now? Because oversimplifying the problem isn't working for us. So for me, what I have found really exciting is the wrong word, because I'm also terrified at the same time right now. You know, I've got my daughters listening to this conversation. So, you know, this is real. This is happening. I'm kind of taken aback by how, lo and behold, the basic tenets of ecological design are proving to be true. One, everything is connected, as I've already mentioned before. And thank you all for covering much of what matters there. But if I were to really focus in on the fact that in my own world of space design, oh my gosh, the lessons I've learned really can apply here. If we really do build a diverse and hierarchical system of spaces and connections, it's going to make a difference. I'm thinking about landscape ecology that talks about ecotones, the principles of landscape ecology, edges, patches, and corridors, and matrices. How can we break down an environment to support all our various needs through human experience, biophysical experience, and lo and behold, social distancing and the coronavirus? It still works. Landscape architecture, prospect and refuge. Same concept. How do we break down our physical environment into smaller pieces to serve multiple uses, right? Cognitive science, no less, is doing the same thing, right? Thigmotaxis, right? The wall hugging trait, which Sussman and Hollander have written a short book on, that lo and behold, people like the edges broken down into smaller little pieces, which is exactly what landscape ecology principles are telling us. So the big picture is, folks, what we're talking about really does work. And on one hand, I'm like, all right, wow, I haven't been wasting my time. On the other hand, it's kind of frightening how far we are from actually practicing these principles and values of ecological design. So in short, and I've just got a couple case studies here, just to note that, you know, based upon my hypothesis here, that based upon ecological design principles, that we really can socialize and social distance at the same time. We can be human and be resilient relative to this new catastrophe. You know? Big picture, right? We know that, well, the global economy hasn't really served us well, right? Being overly consumerist and related to sort of single source transportation lines has been a problem. Now, right, the virus has found itself around the world within months. That's interesting. What about urban density versus suburban sprawl? Well, right, New York City, Boston, Chicago, India, you name it, those dense areas are getting hit pretty hard. Does that mean we should suburbanize? Well, hold on. We'll get to that. We'll come back to that. Does that mean development is bad? Well, we've got to engage with the world, right? You know, I came across an article the other day that noted that development isn't bad within working ecosystems. Excuse me. Engagement isn't bad within working ecosystems. It's the disruption of those ecosystems. It's about going to those ecosystems and disrupting the bats and what is it? I don't know how to pronounce it. The penguins that may be the origins of this virus. So how do we really engage with the world in a way that works? Well, here are my case studies to maybe prove the point that ecological design principles work. You know, the first thing that came to me is Richard Register's ecosystem principles. Anybody know about Richard Register in Berkeley, California?
Yeah.
Right. He noted that he came up with a design for Berkeley, California, for example, and he noted that, well, what if we just break it up into spatially distinct districts based upon where water runs, where topography is, where plant communities exist? All of a sudden, we're going to break ourselves up into effectively a socially isolated set of districts and neighborhoods that are actually also aligned with identity and sense of place. Then we break that up further and into green belts, and what's in between those districts are actually, in fact, working ecosystems. That's at the really big scale, right? We jump down a little smaller, and maybe every one of you saw this. Did everyone see that article? I don't know who wrote it. I didn't actually note it down. About that in Italy, neighbors are singing songs in communities across the country, across the street to each other. That the actual, if we step down and scale a little bit in our physical design world, that there are ways of designing our cities where the cross section of the street can actually foster neighborhoods, can foster identity. It can, and at the same time, actually foster what? Socialization and social distancing at the same time, right? Another example of resilience at a smaller scale. Zooming in a little bit more, if you have ever been victims of any of my classes, probably none of you have, but I talked about this ad nauseum, right? I love how Jane Jacobs talks about the difference between the new tenement developments that occurred after taking down all those brownstone neighborhoods, whether they be in Boston, Chicago, LA, New York. Those brownstone environments were fantastic from an ecological standpoint. They took ecosystems at a literal point of view. They broke it down to small neighborhoods and districts for control and identity. Various scales through streets in different paths and connectors, and roofs and edge conditions. At the street level itself, windows with street access, porches, stairs, spaces between the stairs, sidewalks, tree lines, rows of cars, the narrow street section. Again, breaking it down in scale. So what? We had a whole variety of different opportunities to socialize, to be human, and in fact, socially distance ourselves. It's really, I'm really re-energized by this question, folks. The last two things, and I'll stop burning you folks, because I'm a broken record here. I'm also reminded of the single house neighborhoods in Charleston and why can I think of the other southern city that have the single house building type, where yet again it's single lot development, zero lot line development, creating the side yard, which creates a controllable space where people can effectively isolate themselves socially or physically or whatnot, and yet still have contact with the sidewalk and the street. Herman Hertzberger has another version of this in Amsterdam with his Dijkhoonhuizen. In short, folks, I'm just kind of amazed by the fact that we are on target, we're on message here. That looking at how things are connected, in particular in this case, this is my thing, through spatial design, this shit works. It works. And the big challenge here, and I think, Tony, I really think you hit it most explicitly, though all of you referenced it. The big challenge is cultural paradigms. How do we take people into this world of connectivity in a way that's manageable? Because up until today, people haven't perceived the impacts of externalized social costs, where energy really goes and the real cost to environment and society. Well, I think we've seen it today. Here it is. We're actually perceiving it. We're experiencing it. Maybe people will look up. All right. That's my thing.
All right. Thank you.
I told you earlier that I've been jonesing for a connection, so it kind of all vomited out, folks. So thanks for your patience.
No, I appreciate it, Andy, and I hope we get a chance to loop back in a couple of minutes to some of the questions you raised. The one that I've been thinking a lot about is population density in terms of urban design, and whether or not that's a question we need to be rethinking. But before we jump into the conversation, I see that Jesse Hernrich has joined us now. And Jesse, not to put you on the spot, but I had hoped that you might be able to talk with us a little bit about your own background, and then how permacultural design principles might have something to offer in the age of a global pandemic. And welcome.
Hi, thank you. I apologize for being late. I was unable to move one of my other meetings. And I think just like everyone else here, we're kind of itching for connection and communication. And so the meeting went much longer than I had planned because people are itching to talk. But thank you for inviting me. Your question is, how can the permaculture principles aid in, combating a pandemic like this? Maybe you could rephrase your question just so I can catch up a little bit.
Sure. Actually, some of the most interesting conversations that I've had over the past year or so with people in a wide variety of different fields, not just ecological design, is what wisdom is there in those permacultural design principles that could be applied outside of actual growing of food to questions like, how do we congregate together? What are the ideal conditions for humans to thrive in connection with natural communities, that sort of thing. So take it whatever way you would like to, but I've just heard so much wisdom from people who've been able to apply these permaculture principles in surprising settings.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate you kind of breaking the boundary of permaculture just outside of growing food. That's not, the principles can be applied to many, many things. And so one of the things I think we're talking a lot about in our permaculture discussions is putting some of the principles in more of an economic state or frame. So, for one, we've got this, value renewable resources. One incredibly renewable resource that we have is human capital. And so valuing that human capital is going to be really, really important. Starting small, we've been discussing, equating that to supporting local businesses and not just the big box stores. I think we've had a really good wake up call in in a pandemic environment like this about, purchasing from Amazon. And it's great to, be able to get all the things that you need from a big box store like that. Don't get me wrong. I love me some Amazon. All right. But, being able to choose between what you're able to get and how you're able to support a local business for some of your needs, as well as, resorting to more of a big box environment to supply you with some of the things that you may not be able to get. And then the question of density is a really, really brilliant one. And I do really wish I would have heard what my dear friend Tony Brown was able to say about that, because I fear that one of the biggest things that comes up in an environment such as a pandemic is the world is too dense, we live too close together. That's a problem. Yet the inverse of that is an argument that we've been discussing in ecological design and, sustainable urban planning for a while, which is that density is important. It takes up less arable land if placed appropriately in areas where there's non-contiguous, ecosystem value or wildlife migration. But density is kind of a part of our new reality. So how do you design for density while maintaining privacy and public health? That's something that I'm not necessarily sure I have a total answer to, but that I love having conversation about. I don't believe that it has to be an either or. I believe that we can achieve both through the change in the way that we manage buildings, especially larger, more compact city-based apartment buildings. And so that's something that comes up that is an easy target in an environment like this, sad enough. But density is important as long as it's designed, really, really well. One of the other things that we talk about too with permaculture, the first rule and the last rule are the back, right? Coming from a science background, I look at that as, you can't manage what you can't measure. So you put something on the ground, and that's really when the work begins. And the work is documenting, is monitoring. That relates to things like testings, in this current COVID environment. Not only is it a test once, but it's a test multiple times to see where community spread happens, how community spread happens. And having that feedback loop to inform, the next series of responses. Sorry, I'm running through my 14 principles in my mind as I'm going through this. The use of valuing renewable resources is another one that comes up for me. In that what we're going to start seeing in cases of global pandemics are smaller, more so we're on an advantage as permaculture designers. That applies to energy, but that applies to all other resources as well. Smaller and more decentralized, meaning, you're not going to fight globalization at large. Pieces, like I said earlier, with purchasing certain items from a local store, like masks or toilet paper or whatever it is from Amazon that's, coming across the globe. So decentralizing your needs a little bit. I often come from a place when teaching permaculture. I have no desire to encourage people to go back to 40 acres and a mule. That never worked. We don't have enough land. It doesn't have to mean a life of drudgery. It has to mean being able to operate a semi-capitalist system that works for the new globe, the new paradigm of mass density, large quantities of people. How we still decentralize those and hold those without taking too much of a hit to the economy that does make the world go round. The other piece, going back to kind of the economic piece, is, diversity. Nature teaches us that diversity is key. Right now is definitely a time to, diversify your portfolios, save money, invest in things that follow the permaculture principles, follow the ecological principles, but diversify your portfolio. So little bits here and little bits there. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't, push the boulder uphill, so to speak. Those were some of my kind of top of mind things. I know that they've kind of been in the, you know, economic globalization context, but, you know, I like to keep it there because I think that's the reality of the world that we live in. So as great as living buffers are, which I'm assuming those have come up in this conversation, clean air, clean water, living buffers, we also do have to introduce into the conversation the economy, and the overpopulation of the planet and how to manage density. So, you know, I'm happy to take any thoughts and questions on that, but I feel pretty complete with my preliminary 2 cents on those topics.
Great. Well, thank you, Jesse. We're so glad that you could join us. And I would just like to open things up now for a larger conversation. I know we have a number of different perspectives represented. That this question of population density has been raised, and maybe we'd like to go forward with that. I know that we've got a variety of perspectives. Adam is living down at Arcosanti right now. Jen, as I had mentioned, is a mayor from Hillsborough, North Carolina. Steve, I know you've been working with some larger areas, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and other areas beyond that in terms of design. So, but I'd love to hear from anybody. If we'd like to start with the topic of density and what does a pandemic mean for thinking about density in urban design. That's a question that's already on the table, or we can move from there if nobody would like to deal with that. And by the way, I would say just unmute yourself if you'd like to have a conversation. If we end up with people competing with each other, then we can move to using the chat to let folks know that you'd like to say something. So let's go ahead and just dive in. Tony?
Yeah, I mean, I want to put this in context because especially the issue of density, because I have some statistics here which are quite startling. So according to the UN, by 2050, 6 billion people will live in cities, and that's almost double today's total of 3.5 billion people. That means that the world's going to need at least 50% more food, 45% more energy, and 30% more water. And that's incredibly daunting if we're just going to look at business as usual. So are we going to build housing in individual houses for all of those people that want to move to cities? Are we going to, how are we going to provide the food for that? And I think one of the issues for me is we're not really thinking in integrated systems. Systems need to be integrated, in my opinion, because where you live has to produce the food that you eat, and it has to produce the energy that you require, and it has to produce the resources that you need. What happens right now is cities, in essence, are magnets for energy resources coming from outside, for food resources coming on long supply chains, for all the products that we want, the clothing coming on long supply chains to come to our cities. So even though the cities are dense, they have a huge footprint across the planet. So how do we begin to produce integrated systems that can provide all of those things? Well, certainly, again, I'm biased because of my experience with Solari, but I really do believe that we need to look at the city as not just as a, you know, as an idea that we have to improve or to change it, but that has to look at this as actually a national security issue, because trying to house and feed and clothe that many people, obviously this is a world figure, not just for the US, but that means that we're actually either going to destroy the land by spreading across it, destroying our food sources in the process, or we're going to end up with people with no homes, no food, no water even. So my view is, can we do that? And I came up with a concept that I think has some merit, is that we should begin to look at how can we actually make prototype regenerative cities. And the idea was that if every state was given $1 billion, when I came up with that, that sounded like a lot until they put in $2 trillion in support for the virus issue. And that idea is that you set up a whole series of parameters, like it has to be self-sufficient in food, it has to be self-sufficient in energy, self-sufficient in water, and so on. And then have a prototype built in each state that would, in fact, then prove out what could work and what couldn't work. Because what we've been doing is we've been building cities on an 18th century model. In fact, that model goes back to the Romans. The Romans developed the grid system that we use in our cities. So I think it's really interesting that here we are in the 21st century still building our cities in the same way the Romans did. So I think we need to really begin to look at how do we experiment? How do we find out new things? How do we find out about new systems that we can integrate to make a whole totally different future for ourselves and hopefully a better one? So I'm throwing that out as a thing.
I'd like to touch on that, you know, just from my experience of what I'm dealing with right now. For those of you that don't know, I've made a career change, and now I'm going where the work is needed the most. I say that instead of saying I'm working for the devil. But made a transition into real estate development. And we manage a really high density apartment building. And it's not a regular sort of apartment building, but it's co-living. Okay, so co-living is this really great concept that we've been exercising since, you know, the 60s. A lot of my experience with co-living was places that Tony had introduced me to, and living at Arco Santi and visiting Milagro, which is co-housing. But this is more high density inner city, designed for millennials and Gen X, co-living, where people are starving for community. How do we manage buildings in that way that supply all the things that we talk about, which is shared utilities to bring down your costs and to bring down usage? Not every, you know, unit has its own full kitchen. Community working spaces, so not everybody we're not having to build for each company having its own office, but we're sharing. You know, these are principles that we've really appreciated and I dare say kind of championed in the eco design and in the permaculture world, but do pose challenges when it comes to cleanliness, when it comes to managing those type of spaces. And so what I see is both on Tony's scale of creating an entire city that needs to be reworked and refunctioned, because the cities that we've been designing, as he said, were from the Romans. They were why cholera and the plague exploded. But we need to also rethink, you know, how do we manage, take a step back in scale, and, you know, how do we manage even just a building that has 360 units in it of shared space? So looking at how do we recreate what personal responsibility tenants, people, or neighborhood people have, as far as the way that they treat space, as far as how they take responsibility for being clean and respectful to their neighbors. how do we restructure, you know, payment where you're no longer hiring civil workers to take your trash out or to sweep the streets or to disinfect your lobbies. I chime in here just to say that it's fascinating how everything happens on multiple scales at the same time. And we've been really challenged with, and again, still working on it, still working on finding the answers, but using these concepts to get us to those answers of, you know, how do we rethink and not just go with business as usual? So I appreciate you bringing that in, Tony, and I just wanted to kind of share it happens on multiple scales as well.
Thanks, Jesse. I see that we have a question on the chat that I had missed earlier from Kyle asking, can we hear from Stephen Lucas especially about where building science meets ecological design?
I'll default to Lucas.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question, Kyle. I saw that. I've been thinking about it a little bit. For me, building science is in ecological design. Like I said earlier, my work focuses a lot on climate design. So looking at the climate in a particular area and thinking about how a building builds a relationship with climate to maximize the potential for passive energy in terms of passive solar or passive ventilation. What's really interesting, I think, about building that properly addresses climate and its design, it becomes a very delightful building. We're building a house right now for a client outside of Bloomington. It's a very simple gable design, outdoor living space, but it's oriented such that it takes in a lot of sun in the winter. It shades the sun, or it shades the sun in the summer. Very intentional placement of operable windows to get breezes through the building, and then also views to the natural environment. And it's as compared to the house that I live in, which is you know, talking about old Roman style models of cities. It's just the old style of suburban house with small windows, low head heights, no operable windows, no ventilation. It's a very delightful place to live. So for me, that's a really big overlap between building science and ecological design. I really appreciate Steve's comments about how to integrate nature into every aspect of building design, regardless of scale. I mean, if you don't have the benefit of living in a rural environment, which Tony said, 6 billion people living in cities by 2050, is that right, Tony? Yeah. You know, how do we bring nature into these smaller spaces and create these biophilic experiences? Personally, I think we could look back to some of the Japanese garden design and how they brought, they miniaturized nature into these tiny little gardens in their backyards to bring in that expansive sort of prospect experience of nature in very small spaces. And then, of course, the food production piece is extremely important. We saw a lot of people starting seeds, and we have a backyard chicken scenario happening right now too. And so my panic buying was chicken food, you know, so. But I'll hand it off to Steve.
You know, I want to follow that up. I've done a lot of LEED projects, for example, a lot of green building science studies, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, it leaves me pretty flat. I'm going to take your question and really answer it very, very directly. Clearly, we need to figure out how to save more energy and save more resources via the construction of our built environment. It's taking up, you know, we talked about this earlier, right? 40% of our yearly energy. Lord knows how we measure that in terms of its environmental degradation. But that's great. The high-tech solution is important. But let's bring it down to the low tech. You know, a passive house on its own in the middle of the woods isn't doing very much, in my opinion. That isn't looking at the big picture. How do we bring it into that, the integrative solution that Tony's talking about, Lucas is talking about, Steve, Jessica too, and certainly with her permaculture background. It's not all about the BTUs. And I think that solution has to be brought into a broader conversation. You know, LEED, what will we do without LEED? LEED is a child really of the 1970s, where we had to use science to create measurable impacts to support regulation. Well, thank goodness we did that, right? Good start, necessary start. But I'm really liking, for example, the Living Building Challenge. That's taking in a much broader spectrum of the questions that we've all been asking. But, you know, we need to go further than that, because the Living Building Challenge doesn't tell us about those spaces that we live in. The Living Building Challenge isn't going to solve Corona, right? What are those actual spaces that we live in that allow us to, well, live with Corona from now on and still be human, to still be in a dense city? Being human means socializing. It means being in dense places, socially speaking. How do we do that? Building science won't get us there.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, the Living Building Challenge, I was at Bioneers this past October and saw some interesting demonstrations, but I was struck by how remarkably unaffordable every example that I saw was, and how do you apply some of those lessons to affordable housing? Different question. Steve, I saw that you had a comment, and I was hoping to bounce back to a question that was raised. Actually, Lucas made the point about the need for outdoor spaces in urban areas, and I imagine that some of your work with cities in New England have involved proposing some sort of green spaces. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that project might look like, and especially as we're thinking about the need to provide access to such spaces at a time like this.
Yeah, I'll keep it kind of short. I just sent Laird a message. I have to leave to go to my son's birthday. Again, considering we're quarantined together, I want to be really good to him on his birthday. So I guess one of the thoughts is just in some of the communities that we've worked with, Laird, the standards required for new development or for redevelopment don't ask for much. We set a really low bar. And so here we are, we have this process where we're having a developer come into the community and we're not being clear about what we're wanting to see in our community. And if anything, we're actually enabling them to systematically pull apart these natural resource networks and leave us with a more degraded scenario and not that regenerative design that Tony talked about. And so it's fairly easy to start to think about how do we integrate the needs of the site so that stormwater needs, landscaping needs, could also provide other ecosystem services, could maybe provide some on-site food, maybe provide a variety of spaces for people. And so I don't want to go too long with my answer, but I think we have the system in place to do that. We just failed to do it because we're not integrating, as has kind of been the theme of the talk today. We're not considering how to pull all these things together at the site or municipal scale.
Great. Well, don't want to keep you from your son's birthday, Steve, so if you need to sign off, we're so grateful to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I'll disappear at some point, but for now.
Right. I'm just going to add a couple quick comments, kind of building off of what Andrew and Steve were talking about and the question about building science and ecological design. I fully agree with Andrew. I think building science can lead to really poor buildings if just looked at in terms of building science. But if we think about integrating building science and ecological design, I think we can come up with some pretty interesting solutions that get back to this notion of resource integration. And I heard Tony talking about that. And resource integration, just to give a brief description, is about how we use one resource, let's say one downstream resource like stormwater in a food production system to grow food, or to grow vines that are going to shade the building that are going to reduce energy usage, right? So if we think about resource integration as a way of bringing building science and ecological design together, I think there are many opportunities to create delightful buildings that also reduce energy usage. For example, we did a restaurant up in Indianapolis, and we had this existing building with western-facing garage doors that we wanted to have some transparency, but we also knew it was going to be taking a lot of sun from the western side. It was going to overheat. So we created a 30-foot-long trellis with vines, wisteria growing up over the trellis to help shade the building, right? So there we're using building science and ecological design and bringing nature into the environment to make a pleasant space. So how all those things can work together to reduce energy, to create more delightful spaces, to increase biodiversity and access to food. I think, you know, when we start talking like that, I start thinking about a better built environment for our future.
Thank you, Lucas. So you agree for sure that the building science and the ecological design outside.
Sorry, what was that, Kyle?
I just wanted to ask, so you agree that building science and the aspects of the building and characteristics inside and the ecological design outside can be integrated in those kind of ways and bring those together?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's, you know, it's nice to see how this conversation is all coming together, to be getting integrated like that, to make this whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, right? With all these pieces working together at multiple scales.
Great. Somebody else was starting to make.
I find it sorry, this is Jessie. I find that an inlet in here to circle back to, and pardon me, I didn't catch who made the comment, but about, you know, the Japanese gardens being an interesting prototype or precedent for something like that. I also recently was, you know, able to, prior to this, you know, make some visits to some larger apartment buildings in Japan and China. And one of the things that I kept coming around to, and that was really profound for me, having never visited China, was there's also a cultural piece, or Asia, excuse me, never having visited Asia. There's an interesting cultural piece to building science and the way that things that happens over there. That a lot of lessons could be learned. One of the biggest takeaways for me was, again, because of cleanliness and because of building management systems, you know, how they enter, what they experience when entering the building. Generally, this maze of landscaping, the entryways are not always the most obvious places for points of entry, unlike, you know, the American or European, where we have a columns, the entry is very obvious to us. But they sort of have this maze through greenery that allows you to enter and take a moment of peace. But then you have the process of entering not only the building, but entering your space includes washing the things that the CDC has asked us to do now. Wash your groceries, take off your shoes, take off your outer layers. Those are systemic culture for us is, you know, and I've got something on my kitchen counter with my shoes on, or I'll come in with my groceries and go all the way through my house to my kitchen before I start cleaning my vegetables. with, you know, my reusable bags. I can't tell you the last time I washed my reusable bags prior to COVID. There were some very, very fascinating, you know, pieces of how we treat and enter our living space that I took a lot away from. And I think that they're to build, and I'd be curious to hear from any of the building science people, A, if they've interacted with any of that, B, any of their, you know, thoughts and feelings about it, and C, how can we maybe design buildings to build, if it's not in our cultural DNA, how design buildings to create those sort of safeguards, for the lack of better words.
You know, Jessica, I've been dying to ask you this question since we started. I've taught quite a few permaculture courses myself, and though I think permaculture truly has an important place in our discussion, I've kind of have a love-hate relationship with permaculture.
Me too.
About that too, actually. Let me just give you my brief thought of it. And as I think all of us understand, and probably most of our listeners, we're talking about an extraordinary complex problem here, reality, right? That's what we're trying to design for. And there are an awful lot of theories about how to do that relative to our professional backgrounds, whether it's buildings, people, bugs, you know, the horseshoe bat, which may be the origin of coronavirus, you name it.
Don't discriminate.
There's a lot of science and knowledge there. There's a lot of complexity. But at the end of the day, we have to somehow convey how to think about these things. And I think personally, that's where permaculture, despite any reservations I may have about it, really does a great job. You know, it really brings down the questions through its principles in a way that's accessible, through the idioms that are evident through its design principles. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that comment. That is permaculture a more accessible way to kind of access the basic idea of ecological design? And have any of your clients or participants ever sort of suggested as much?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I came at permaculture through agriculture, and I have spent, and I still have that knowledge, but I no longer teach or communicate about permaculture in an agricultural context. What permaculture is for me, like you said, is a set of principles that really pointedly at what I call the first day class. Permaculture is nothing but a applied concept. So you can take these principles and like your color and look, you know, and look through of permaculture. I hate teaching permaculture techniques because techniques any world work an agricultural situation solely is nothing more than a niche garden kit. You know, has determination built in what works in this type type of soil isn't going to work in that type of soil. But it is a great set of principles that are nothing than. So does that answer your question? Sort of?
End or someone's end, I couldn't hear all that you said.
Oh, can you hear me better now? Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you okay. You're breaking up a fair amount, Jesse, but we'll work with what we got, I guess. So I appreciate your answer very much. Katie May, you had raised a question a little bit ago about smart cities. And I guess I wonder if other folks have experience with smart cities, but as I recall, Katie May, you dug pretty deep into that as part of your graduate work. Is that correct? If you can, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about that, if you're comfortable, that'd be great.
Yeah, sorry, my cat jumped up and whacked my laptop. I'm still doing my master's. I'm doing the Resilient and Sustainable Communities program at Prescott. And one of the places that I've been looking at is design charrettes and community charrettes. And I've actually been working with a group in New Hampshire called Plan New Hampshire, which runs community design charrettes for people all across the state. And through them, I was introduced to an organization called Strong Towns, and they have a book out. And it's all about how American cities grew to be the way that they are. The guy who wrote the book, Charles Moran, he talks about how cities are evolving and how they grow in that sense, and how before the US specifically, there was a lot of evolution that happened incrementally, and things grew incrementally. And then within the last 60 years, we've started designing and just building things 100% all at once. And in his opinion, that's really bad. But they have a lot of really good ideas about working with communities and cities to look at their zoning, to look at their policies, and how they're related to how those towns grow and how they support each other as communities. And I just felt like it fit in here because one of the things they talk about is things like tiny houses, what's allowed, what's your minimum lot size, and all of those concepts. So I just wanted to throw it out there. They have tons and tons of information on everything from traffic patterns and how we've become such an automobile-dominated society and what that means for how we build cities and how we build towns, how we connect with each other or not connect with each other. So it's just a really, really cool resource that I wanted to bring up and throw out there because I think the folks here would really enjoy it. So I can put the name of the book and the guy who wrote it in the chat, but yeah.
Thanks, Katie May. And that's a perfect lead in talking about minimum house size and that sort of thing to Jen, who wanted to make a comment about the relationship between the coronavirus and public policy. And again, Jen is the mayor of, I believe, Hillsborough, North Carolina. Is that right, Jen?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Great. Go ahead.
Thanks, Laird. So first of all, just thank you, everyone. This is really, I could sit around and listen to y'all talk for a long time because it feels very relevant to the kind of community we want to be building here. Right before, so Hillsborough is in Orange County. It's the same county that UNC Chapel Hill is in. We're very close to Durham. We're a very progressive community, racially diverse. But as some of you have studied, planning and policy, you may be familiar with the idea that even in very progressive communities, people are extremely resistant to density. I mean, there are folks who are very environmentally cognizant. They're really interested in sustainability and local food and building our local food system. But there is the same energy against subdividing a lot to allow 2 houses instead of 1 house as there is to allow, 20 houses. So that is, that's the policy environment that I am in. And right before the coronavirus hit, we were about to send out an RFP to get a consultant to help us with a comprehensive sustainability plan and a climate action plan. And, you know, part of that has to be a deep community engagement. And, you know, in talking with staff, you know, we're like, we really need to figure out how to communicate with people about the idea of density and how that is congruent with environmental sustainability and also affordable housing. You know, affordable housing is a really big problem here because we're a place where people want to live. Land prices are extremely expensive. So that disconnect is pretty serious in every community where I have, you know, colleagues across the country. And it's a hard nut to crack. I mean, I can talk, you know, anyway, I won't go into that too much longer. So then the pandemic hits, and what I'm worrying about now is that the message is people are going to take away from that is, well, don't be dense. You know, you've been telling us we need to stay apart from each other to be safe for the past, you know, however many weeks it ends up being. And now you're telling us we need to live closer together when we've been telling you that we don't want to do that anyway. And so that's just something that I'm thinking about as the messaging piece, is that my takeaway from the pandemic isn't don't build dense communities. It's let's take care of each other better. Let's build, you know, let's repair the cracks that the pandemic is exposing so deeply of race and class and, you know, healthcare and all of these things. So, you know, when I think about the scholarly end, I always yearn for more effective connections between the scholarly end, the policy-making end, and the community end. So thank you for all your comments today.
So can I respond to that a bit? You know, one thing that's always amused me is Americans go to Europe and they go to these dense cities and they walk around these dense cities where there's no cars and they go, oh, this is so wonderful. And then they come back home and say, I'm never getting out of my car. Don't tell me I should live in a dense city. And you know, I realize that's not a really good example for you to use, but maybe it is. Here in Prescott, there's also this idea, particularly in Chino Valley, that if you have 2-acre lots, then you're maintaining a rural atmosphere. Well, of course you're not. You're just destroying the rural atmosphere and destroying the ecology at the same time. There was a software person who was at Prescott College some time ago, and they came up with a piece of software that would actually translate codes into what would happen on the ground. And what they did is they were actually in Wyoming, and they met with a whole different bunches of people. They met with real estate developers, they met with environmentalists, they met with government people all separately. And it turned out that at the end of the day, when they put all what people wanted on this piece of software, everybody said, that's not what we want, because it showed the whole of Wyoming basically covered with housing. So somehow to find a way of visually showing what the results of that particular code requirement is might be a way of persuading your residents that look what happens if we expand and we use this code versus what happens if we expand and use that code. I honestly don't know what happened to the software. It was a NASA piece of software. And I could dig around, see if I can find out where that went. But it seemed to me to be an incredibly useful tool. And there may be other tools out there that you could use to do the same kind of thing. You know, I wish I had some more references for you to look up, but you know,
I'll jump in real fast, Jen, just to make some connections between the struggles you're having and some of the struggles we're having in Bloomington. We are actually going to have a little symposium in Bloomington to kind of broaden the discussion about architecture and planning in our region, and formerly lived in Austin, Texas. And so a couple interesting developments that you might want to look into would be the new UDO, or the Unified Development Ordinance here in Bloomington. Our mayor, John Hamilton, he's a great guy. He's been pushing really hard for more density and affordable housing in Bloomington. And again, we're seeing a lot of the same pushback with the density piece. Trying to get triplexes and fourplexes in single family neighborhoods has been a real challenge. But Austin has been, I mean, when you talk about density issues, you know, with Austin, it's kind of crazy. And they're now working on a new development ordinance that would take single family neighborhoods and essentially allow a single family house to turn into a single family lot with 8 families on it along the main corridors. So it's really interesting to see and watch what Austin is doing. And the plan was to have an architect come up from Austin and talk about their growing pains with the cost of real estate and the density, and how we in Bloomington might be able to learn from them. So just a couple resources you might want to look into.
Jen, I just wanted to piggyback on that too. There's 1 or 2 organizations, depending upon how you look at it. Place Matters out of Boulder, Colorado. They're associated with, believe it or not, the Orton Foundation here in Vermont. They actually have a program that does exactly what Tony just described, that allows one to visually represent density and development over time. It's reasonably effective, it really is. But let me just caution you that, you know, the big void in any of these programs, or for that matter, the planning world in general, is density isn't just about, right, how many units you can squeeze into an acre. Density is about the experience of space. It's about how you control space between units. There's this imaginary desire that, well, why can't we all just get along and share some shared space? But that's not how we work. We want space to control, so we know where we can put our garden, where we can find a private space. In any case, Place Matters and the Orton Foundation have that program. It's pretty cool, but one needs to be guided by someone who understands how people actually experience space.
Yeah, I'll just say that one of, this isn't, I don't think precisely what you may be talking about, but I've been trying to change my language when I speak about this in the community, is that instead of using the word density, because I do think that sounds like more of a cudgel, is I say safe, walkable communities. And that, because that seems to be more what we're really trying to describe.
Right.
So I do want to jump in for just a moment. This is fascinating, and we can certainly continue the conversation. We're creeping up on 2 hours. So this is actually the longest one of these I've run yet, but I think there's so much to be said about it, and some of your experiences that we haven't heard from yet. So it's if we were to end at 3, we've got about 7 more minutes to go. I'd love to hear from anyone we haven't had a chance to hear from that would like to share.
I just have a question for Tony. I think I've more than taken up my airtime. Forgive me, Tony, if this is at all disrespectful. I'm going to assume that you've been around a little longer than most of us. As you've seen the evolution of these questions, what first comes to your mind that you want to share with us youngins?
Well, you know, I think until the thing that's really struck me is the dissolution of cities. even during the Industrial Revolution, cities were places where community happened because, you know, like in New York, you'd have millionaires living next to people who worked in sweatshops just because of the texture of the city. And what's happened, I think, in the last 100, 200 years, maybe, or even less, actually, come to think of it, is that our cities have actually been subject to forces that have made people want to live just with their own peers. In other words, we have segregation, not just in terms of race, but we have segregation in terms of economics. We have segregation in terms of age. You know, Arizona is known for its 55 and older communities where nobody under 55 can live. So we're self-segregating, and watching that happen is really beginning to dissolve the city as a place for egalitarianism. It's actually making the city again, or mostly a place where very rich people can live. I mean, if you try and live in New York on a regular minimum wage salary, you probably, you know, are living in a very substandard kind of place. So I think that's one of the major things that I see as very sad about the city, is that loss of a diversity. And as we all know, nature thrives on diversity. And I think human cultures thrive on diversity as well. And I think we're beginning to lose that more and more and more in our culture in general. And in many ways, social media has made that worse, because now we're in our own little echo chambers where we, you know, watch the media that agrees with us and we talk to people who agree with us. So I have no solution to how you reverse that, but it seems like it's a process that is really beginning to destroy a real sense of community as a country, not just as a town or a city or, you know, as a state. And I would say that to me is one of the major challenges that we face, is how do we get back to this diversity of people? How do we provide space for people who can't, you know, afford $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month rent? So, I mean, I throw that out to this great group of people to come up with a solution to that, because that, I think, would solve a lot of problems.
Tony, I'm going to build on that, because it's really frustrating for me to see how expensive development is. We're working on a project in Bloomington right now. We have a cooperative housing group here, and we're trying to develop this 7,500 square foot house into a 19-bed affordable housing, sort of co-housing unit, two kitchens, a combination of suites and bedrooms. And by the time we go through, even if we get a fairly good price on the real estate, by the time we go through all the hoops to do an urban development, putting in sidewalks, permeable paving, utility connections, fire suppression systems, all of a sudden it's no longer affordable. So we've designed these systems that make safe buildings, which is great, but at the same time, the costs are such that it just makes it very difficult to make them affordable. Even with the best intentions.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're kind of running into that problem on the project we're doing with our students. It's like people want to do affordable housing, you know, and then the only solution we're coming up with is do tiny houses. But, you know, so, you know, to make it affordable, you have to live in a tiny space. But,
I'd like to piggyback on that, Lucas, too, though, because yes, tiny houses, but tiny houses still require an on-ground footprint. And so when we start talking about building multi-story buildings with, you know, in the example of our building, a 312 unit building that's co-living, it becomes incredibly, but we have to stick to the 35% of the new development being 80% or greater AMI, it becomes in a resort town, all right?
Right,
like
right.
I work in Aspen and Vail and Salt Lake, so it becomes incredibly difficult for us to make a building pencil when you want to do the right thing. You need to build workforce and affordable housing. There's no question about that. But the building costs are astronomical. And at the same time, the Board of County Commissioners and their staff are addicted to LEED. And I find myself continually communicating, listen, we have to start thinking beyond LEED, or just like I was saying before, but you couldn't hear me, LEED is a set of principles. So let's take the principles and let the principles guide our movement and our decisions. But if we can't afford the monitoring and, you know, the bells and whistles, it's unattainable for a developer to do it. So when we scale up to a 312 unit co-living building with 30% of it being affordable at 80% or greater AMI, the developer is really, really strapped. And that to me shows the weakest link in the system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jesse. It's a fairly unique set of challenges, I think, at the time, because not too many people are taking on similar efforts. So hopefully the problems that you all are going through in that will help pave the way. Pave is a bad metaphor. Help clear some of the obstacles out of the way for future affordable housing developments. We are at about 3 o'clock now, and that's probably all the time that folks have for this today. I know that we're anxious to make a recording of this and make it available to you. If you want to get a copy of that link, send an email message through the chat, and Carla will be able to send those out to you. On the other hand, we'll also have it available through the Green Mountain Center for Sustainability website, the Masters of Science in Resilient and Sustainable Communities Facebook page, as well as the Prescott College and Prescott College alumni pages. So I'm so grateful to all of you who were able to join us today. Thanks to those of you who prepared some remarks. Lovely to see so many familiar faces. Michael, I'm sorry that I didn't get a chance to hear from you, but I'm so happy to see you. And yeah, thank you. We do this every week. And by the way, Steve Whitman earlier made a comment about hearing people's stories and letting those lead perhaps to planning decisions, policy decisions. It was my intention for next week's community resilience conversation to create a more open conversation. I'm thinking it'll be called Checking In and Holding Space for people who find themselves scattered. They don't feel they're a part of a community. They don't feel the kind of connection that they would like to, really just to hear the stories from people, not only who are professionals working in one or another aspect of dealing with COVID, but to hear from the lived experiences of people just all over the place. So that'll be next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. I'll send out some advertisements and that sort of thing. But thank you so much to everybody who was able to join us today. Be safe. We'll see you around.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Laird.
Bye.
Good seeing you all.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Bye-bye.